Hello, Susan. Thank you for joining me.
Morning.
So, you've got a Quaker background, Susan. That's why we kind of got in touch. And you've been you're a retired medical doctor, obstetrician, I think you said, gynecologist. And I just really wanted to get to know you a little bit and see if we can try and capture some of the Quaker connections that you have, and then think about how that and informs your life work really. And what I've been thinking about recently in some of these interviews is bodies. One of my interviews, he's talked about spiritual embodiment. So I'm just really interested in exploring that at the moment. So can we start with your Quaker connections then? What is your connection?
Certainly. So I come from an Irish Quaker family, the Bewleys, the same family of the coffee houses, which are very famous in Dublin. Um, so my great grandfather um, used to preach about temperance, and my grandfather didn't attend meetings, but my father and his sister were taken as small children and sat quietly. There were no children's meetings separately, but they very much learned the power of sitting in silence for an hour and behaving properly. And my parents came over to England when I was a small child. So I always knew that there was this history, and we were the sort of medical branch of the family as opposed to the business branch of the family. Um, and so all my life I've sort of popped in and out, attended occasional meetings and weddings, and attended courses. I love Friend's House, which is a very peaceful place to go to meetings and to meals and conferences and go to the library. But I think it took me till quite late in life to realize that um, the way I am and who I am and how I think, which isn't like everyone else, which I thought was, everyone thinks like this, but it turns out to be my family, and it's a whole set of Quaker values. I thought everyone was into tolerance and authenticity and honesty and so forth. So I think I've got a sort of weaving in and out with Quakers in terms of the inner values
Hmm.
and the outer expression of it.
That's really interesting. So you don't go to Quaker meeting yourself now as an adult.
I get the friend regularly, and because of seeing an advert and the magazine Quadrant, I've ended up being a trustee of Quad, the Quaker Action on Alcohol and Drugs, and that's partly because my father was an addiction psychiatrist, and I was sort of brought up within the grounds of a very large mental hospital in those days. So the most vulnerable in society and the things that my powerful drugs can do when used by certain people in certain ways, how that damages them. That's very central again to things I think about and care about.
Hmm.
So I have been to meetings. I've tried meetings. And I'm very happy going to meetings on a retreat I've just come from Quad and so forth. So it's a sort of dip in and out, but I don't belong. I'm a sort of small friend of capital friends. I sometimes say I feel like I'm Quaker curious or an ethnic Quaker. I'm obviously not a member of the Religious Society of Friends, and then if I did sort of move forward in that, would I be birthright or convincement? Who knows?
Hmm.
But so it's not. It's I'm sort of a, yeah, a close relative, cousin, something like that.
Yes, Quaker adjacent, I've heard some people.
Quaker adjacent. That may be
Yeah.
what I am.
And of course there's a kind of a move, I think, at the moment to be quite relaxed about how people are involved in Quaker society, if you like. I know that there's a whole movement towards the people that go on a Quaker camp once a year, that they feel Quaker, even though that's the only thing they do once a year. So you're no less connected than any of them, you know. It's really interesting. And what I think is fascinating is how you say that you have been, you've been soaked in those values, haven't you? You've been
Yes.
brought up in that in a way that I haven't been. I came to Quakers in my 30s. So we've got very different experiences. And I suppose that's really what I'm interested in because I personally think Quakers has changed a lot. So if we think about what you were steeped in as a child, that temperance movement, and you just mentioned authenticity and honesty, and there's something that's shifted, I think, in the last 100 years. And I wonder whether you're steeped in values which are a little bit different from how they are today. But I don't know. I don't know. Would you
I
like to say a bit more about how you think that has shaped you then? What are those thoughts and values that you put down to your Quaker background?
um Well, I think my granny used to just say there's good in everybody. She obviously there was God of everybody, but she didn't say that. She used to talk about good in everyone, and she would always find it. And how she talked, she was my favorite granny. Well, I had two, didn't I? One was the one I liked, and one was the one I didn't like. But anyhow, and she just spent her life knowing about everybody's business, talking them up, saying that like people had unfortunate circumstances, or that you if you search for it you will find it. So that was just, well, everyone thinks like that, don't they? And my favorite granny, who was my she was my grandmother, my step grandmother, my great aunt, because my grandfather married his wife's sister when she died, and my godmother. So I had this very sort of special relationship with her, but it wasn't called Quaker, or I mean, we just all were Quakers. That's rather than Protestants or Catholics or Jews or something else. That's the background. And I think the other thing, so that was just, there's a good in everyone. Everyone knows that, don't they? And then when my parents came over to England, my father became a consultant at Tooting Bec Hospital. He lived in there was two houses for the main doctors within the asylum. So I was brought up, in a very privileged way, but inside an institution with 20-foot railings that was shut at night, and was taught that my father's very strong belief was that he was there to give asylum and shelter um, to people who had terribly unfortunate circumstances. And so, and a couple of people who helped in the house one was somebody who'd been in the hospital for 50 years, and he, was there to make us tea. And the gardener, Paddy Mullaney, he was an Irish alcoholic who, when he was in hospital drying out, the garden was dealt with. And when he was out, we'd meet him and say, "Hi, Paddy," lying under a bench. And so I think I was just taught that everyone is equal and the circumstances are different, and you should be extremely respectful to that. So the sense of equality and universality was right there from very early on. And I mean, I don't know if this is right really, but anyhow, one of the things my father would say was that, how you work out whether you're safe or not with people is, if you're on Tooting Bec Common and somebody comes up and says, "Hello, little girl, would you like a sweetie?" Um, you to look down and see if they were wearing slippers, because if they were wearing slippers, they were one of the patients who was out for a walk from Tooting Bec, and they were safe. And if they were wearing polished shoes, they might be, paedophile and malign, and you should scream. So I've always, and we also lived in looking onto a red light area on Tooting Bec Common, and so, as a child, I was taught to spot, what that car was doing, curb crawling that woman, and who was working, to earn money in this way. And I think, so I think just from very early on, the way I looked at the world, or was taught to look at the world, had that sense of equality and universality in it. Somehow, I just, when I look back, I think that I just thought everyone thinks like this, don't they?
Hmm.
And another thing is, my parents used to write to us letters every 10 years saying, in the event of our death, blah, blah, the keys are in the drawer on the left, and the will is here, and so on, and this is what we want for our funerals. And, we'd get these letters, and I thought, does everyone gets these letters from their parents? Turns out they don't, but this sense of being prepared, thinking to the future, sort of keeping your affairs in order, and being very careful about it was very important.
Mm.
And my father was,
Gosh.
standing for the Greens back in the 1970s, looking after the planet and the stewardship of the planet. So there were sort of, I suppose, that some of the radical dissenting ideas, were just there. And, the stories were, he refused to join some club in 1950 something because it wouldn't admit women. And, you know, yeah. I just thought everyone thought I discovered the world was not full of progressive, liberal, tolerant, critical thinkers. So I was very shocked when I grew up that the world was a much more hostile place than home, which was within a mental hospital.
Gosh, that is such an interesting and unusual place to grow up, isn't it? In that in that environment. Because I work in prisons, of course, I'm a prison chaplain. So this kind of locked environment and trying to work out, a little bit about making some kind of, it is a judgment really. It's kind of how do I treat this person and how do I weigh up their actions towards me? And recognizing that some people are malign, actually. Some people will harm you if you're not careful. And you do need to be careful. And there's boundaries that you need to keep. So I'm very aware of that and very alert to that. It sounds like you are too. But I wonder if that's something that's a little bit lost in tolerant society. We've become tolerant of everything, and how you keep those boundaries is something we seem to have lost sight of.
Correct. Correct. And I think although the door was locked, the front gates were locked at night, um, and many of the patients would have been there by force in terms of sections. Most of the patients would have been free to go in and out. Certainly, and I don't remember now whether there were acute wards that were locked. There must have been. And certainly, when my father arrived, there were padded cells because he talked about getting rid of the padded cell. And somebody, having a cigarette and actually dying from burning down in it. And so I think that the sort of the power to police the boundaries or enforce the boundaries or recognize, necessary breach and why it's there, would have been. I mean, it is the stuff of a profession, and it's the stuff of a prison, and it's the stuff of any kind of structure. What are the rules? How do we change the rules? How do we bend the rules? How do we break the rules? What do we do when the rules are broken? What do we do about wrong rules? I mean, this is the stuff of society, isn't it?
Well, it is. And of course, some people do just repeatedly break the rules and repeatedly challenge those where those boundaries are put or wherever they are, and they're pushing against them.
Well,
And
we wouldn't be alive if we didn't. and
yes.
and people push to get in and people push to get out, and people sometimes they find themselves, they've got a foot in two camps, or they're out for a bit and they're in here but out there. So we form groups, even dissenters and rioters and malign forces and criminals, whatever. They're still social animals, and they still group together with their own codes, whether those are, whatever they are.
Yeah, yeah. So it's fascinating that you're working in addiction in that quad role now, which is not actually your own professional expertise, but it's your father's. That's
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. Well, and I think, yes, well, yes, but it sort of called to me, didn't it? When it
Mm.
slips out of the magazine and
Yes.
lands, and they're looking for a trustee, and I was looking for a trusteeship because I've been a trustee of other charities and
Mm.
thinking, I want to continue, offering something if it's of value. If they don't want me, I'm very happy to be thrown out.
Yes. So,
I
so,
haven't,
so
I've no pride on that way.
what is quad then? Why don't we just talk a few minutes about what it is and what it's trying to do and why it needs to exist?
Well, it came about because of bequest, and it's fairly recent. It's only had two directors in its time, one who did a huge amount of research, and the present one who is doing more outreach and attending. I think, well, I don't know if do more or less because I haven't been there long enough, but I think it's got a mission statement, which I don't know off by heart. And we've just had a retreat because we're entering the modern era in terms of governance of ethical investment to continue making money to be able to go out and use it. Um, but it's very interested in the hidden stigma, mostly, primarily within Quakers, because within Quakers there are many people who will be and are struggling with one or other dependence-inducing substance, whether that's alcohol or drugs or betting, or maybe some of the newer ones that are coming in. And betting is now in the remit. And if not, all of us know people who are struggling with, tobacco, alcohol, cocaine, so forth in our lives. And it was very distressing to hear that even in the safety and the safe, loving space of Quaker meetings, there are people who don't say about what's happening to themselves or significant others because the shame and the stigma will pertain to your spouse or child or parent.
Yeah.
So I think that some of it is to do with support for clerks of meetings or individuals who ring in. Some of it is then interfaith work with the all parliamentary party groups trying to get more taxes on the betting and see the tobacco playbook being played out over and over again, all the manipulation, the lies about how there's just a small group. Let's point our finger at the defects rather than the addictive nature of
Mm.
many of these substances and behaviors. So it's a mixture of things at the moment, and it's looking firstly at prudent governance, and then at the moment it's offering a service to ring in, going out, doing webinars, doing sessions at meeting houses, and working at the policy level with other charities in this space, either the faith space or the addiction space. And I think it's increased my understanding also of well, what anyone has to offer, which is either immediate support or seeding ideas, letting those seeds, working out where the soil is fertile to throw those seeds, and where you work and garden together, as it were.
It's so interesting because in my work as a chaplain, alcohol remains the biggest issue. It might then lead into drugs as well, but if somebody is addicted to drugs, they're usually addicted to alcohol as well, and they know that that first drink leads them on that path. And it's really interesting to me that the visitors that come into prison with me over the years will sometimes, in that vulnerable space, in a prison chapel, reveal things about their own past alcoholism or their recovery journey or one of their family members and how they've been, helping them and supporting them. And I do notice that within Quaker meetings we don't talk about it much, and there's not that space to be vulnerable. And as I repeatedly say, I mean, I do these little Sunday morning reflections where I'm really kind of reflecting deeply about it. And I think people don't realize that it's from that vulnerability where we have a really powerful witness or ministry. Whereas people, I get the sense sometimes Quaker meetings, everyone's trying to be perfect. Everyone's trying to show how they've got it all together, And we're really just as messed up as anyone else, because we're just human beings, aren't we? Struggling, to get through. So I didn't actually know that Quad did that. I didn't know that Quad was working within Quaker meetings. Isn't that interesting?
Well, it's yes. I mean, I've attended. I went to a session. I mean, it was put on specially in Cardiff. Well, I don't know how I didn't hear it, but people came from nearby meetings, and we had a sort of day with sort of workshops and reflections and discussions, and so to raise the issues within the meetings
Hmm.
and or within that area. And it's difficult to know what anyone wants. We want to empower us all to know a bit more so that we can help whoever it is at any moment in time and ourselves. I think, and to go and fight this. I mean, my father was very clear that the price of alcohol, it completely changed the distribution of the sort of normal distribution curve of who was drinking. So if the price goes up, more people hit heavy drinking and dependent drinking, and if the price goes down. Whereas the lie is that there's this small group who are doing having a problem, and just watching over my lifetime, watching the size of glasses change, the price go down. And now so many more people just drinking in private, not in pubs, which are no longer smoking and so forth. They're now sort of eating eateries. So there's a lot to do with the culture that we don't notice ourselves drifting into heavy drinking. And I stopped drinking because I just can't keep the weight down. So until I get into the normal BMI, I'm now not going to drink until I get into the normal BMI, and then I'm going to see if I can do it really small. But I think it's a bad habit. Not not and it's a habit that then actually takes over. I think when you get into very serious alcohol dependence, you've got all the classic signs of cravings and tolerance, and people start losing their friends and their families and their jobs. And as with many of those other things that get people into prison, if you start getting into problems and debt, the other addictions people associate more, with cocaine and heroin and betting, that people start lying and stealing and so forth. So, but as you say, I think alcohol is, well, tobacco is the worst. It kills 50% of its customers. Alcohol will
Yes.
eventually damage a huge percentage of its customers and so forth. And my father always explained a stable heroin addict on methadone can actually live a life and then wean down. But uh, things that make you euphoric or change your mood, there isn't a stabilizing in the same way with withdrawal syndromes and some of the others. So each of the drugs, each of the things, it's got its own physical properties, it's got its psychological aura, and then you've got your particular vulnerability, and then obviously throwing the illegality in makes a difference. But I'm just unsure about what legalization and regulation do in each case and how they work. And I think quad is probably a little bit more to the uh, temperance end because it comes from that, and Quakers come from that. And younger people are saying, well, we do all these things perfectly safely, and that's what I thought when I was young. Everything should be legalized and fine, and we were all, in control of things. And,
I
and
used to think all of that when I was
I
young.
don't think it anymore.
I don't think it anymore either. And I know legalization is back on the political agenda and in my 20s I definitely would have thought that was a good idea. Perhaps even into my 30s actually. But one of the things that I'm very conscious of in the prison is that people are suddenly in detox.
Yeah.
They arrive in prison and they suddenly have to go through a detox process. I mean, obviously there is healthcare and they manage that as well as they can. But nonetheless, people are. It's like that scene in Train Spotting, where I forget what exactly it is, but suddenly he's given this thing in hospital. Suddenly he comes rushing into daylight. Suddenly he can see everything. And some of my prisoners are almost in kind of a shock at, wow, here I am, I'm sober, I'm aware of all of my stuff again. I'm aware of all the damage and the havoc that I'm now creating, as well as what's happened to me. And they're remembering all sorts of things about what happened to them in their childhood, things that they've repressed for a long time. Then they're thinking, I'm causing havoc to my loved ones, and now, my sister doesn't talk to me anymore, and my mother's, depressed and kind of worried about me and brought shame on the family. And suddenly, all of this is in crystal clear, view, if you like, and having to help people deal with that. For me, that's the spiritual task, is how do we come to terms with just being a human being in this havoc that we all create with each other? And to me, it is a spiritual task, you see, and that is what the spiritual journey can provide is an alternative to the drugs, you know?
Well, and I think AA was very much modeled on that as the higher power, maybe, and it absolutely. suits some people, doesn't it? But not everyone.
What do you make of that then? Because I use the Serenity Prayer, and everybody finds it so helpful. I've started taking a little, I printed them out so I can give people. I can pinch off this piece of paper and give them a Serenity Prayer because it's a very simple, straightforward thing for a chaplain. I mean, the psychologists and the health people wouldn't be doing that, but as a chaplain, it's a very obvious thing. Would you like a Serenity Prayer? And they always say yes. Well, what do you make of AA then as an approach?
Well, now we're out of my area of expertise. All I know is that my father met the founder of the Irish AA back in the 1950s in North America, and he valued it greatly. Um, uh, and I hear from people how valuable it is. I'm going to play in London next soon on the fifth step, which I think will be very interesting. So it clearly it's interesting. One of the people in my death cafe was in AA for years and talks about what he learned from it and how some of the things we're doing in Death Cafe parallel that. And he talks about being of service and how what helped him when he was absolutely despairing with someone else. I've been here, it'll be all right. And so that witness or testimony of this road is well traveled, it's been traveled before, and we give to each other within a framework, which I think, I mean, I don't know because haven't studied that much, but it seems to be one of a spiritual progress and a progress of reconciliation, a progress of recognition, and so forth. So it seems to be amazing and powerful. And it was very interesting. He's explaining to me about how it operates in terms of money that they don't advertise at all. They won't accept money of all sorts. And how each meeting has to pay its way. And there's some really strong rules or culture that keep it intact. And so interesting how you talk about Quakerism changing and has AA changed or what does it offer? Is it an unmovable set of processes? And I think processes are very interesting around those rules,
Yeah.
whatever those rules are. These processes matter. Now, obviously, spirituality isn't contained within rules, so it's a different thing.
Well, that's right. And I think the rules of culture, you see, when you was talking, I was thinking about the way in which I run my group in prison. And there it is quite the rules of the culture, if you like, within my group, I have to be quite firm about what those rules are because within that prison context of people who've never been to a church, never been inside a chapel, never been to a quiet space, they don't quite know what the rules are. So I'm quite clear because one of the things that I'm very aware of is if people get the rules wrong, they get chastised by the group and then they end up feeling, you know, I'd rather be clear in advance about what the rules are so that everybody knows how we are here is we don't interrupt, we just try to listen deeply to what somebody's saying so that they don't have to naturally kind of interrupt people because we all do that all the time. And then people kind of, and then there's a kind of a shame response then, isn't there? Which doesn't help. So I suppose one of the things about rules within a Quaker setting and in any groups is how do you helpfully set out the rules so that everybody's very clear and we can all learn how to be together? Because AA is just another type of group, like a Quaker meeting is, like any kind of group. And it's in small groups that we learn together, isn't it? And grow as people, really.
Mm, mm, mm.
Tell me
But
about,
um, I mean, obviously the one-to-one relationship, well, a one-to-one relationship, with a bit of luck, you get 50% out of your partner or your child or your parent or whatever. So one-to-one relationships are the most powerful. The groups, um, I think there's something about the settling down and the silence at the beginning and end, and the silence between contributions that's very familiar and Quakerly maybe. And in the death cafes, we try and do that. We rotate facilitators, so there's no power games going on, and we feed back to each other in between meetings. And we very much just try and slow it down and talk about that deep listening and making sure that if anyone did get interrupted, that we come back to them. And once you've got a way of working, people come, they
Yeah.
see that's how it works. They may not even be able to articulate what is it that makes it work. But as you say, the setting of the rules, which you know, and then each group um, uh, will come to see. I mean, I was amused because that thing about shh or whatever. Oh, it was terrible. At my father's funeral, there was some terrible man who came down from Northern Ireland to Dublin because all the relatives are buried in a Quaker cemetery in Dublin. And there was a celebrant who was an ex-Anglican priest turned Quaker. And anyhow, everyone was doing their bit. Lots of silence, occasional small contributions. And then this man started to decide, he thought, oh, this isn't right. I think he'd never attended a Quaker funeral, and he sort of thought that there wasn't a proper eulogy. So he started talking entirely about himself and his relationship with my father. And he just went on and on and on and on. And it was like the rudest thing in my entire life. And of course, everyone was terribly po-faced and well-behaved. And eventually it came to an end. And then the man obviously let a little bit more come on because he realized this has been eaten up. People say, ah, yes, but he didn't have this natural thing of tapping on the top hat, tap, tap, you're talking too much. That was the old way, apparently. Or saying, thank you, friend, for your contribution. And, interrupted because there is a place to do that. And I thought, well, I
Mm-hmm.
never knew
Yeah.
that there are, these means and phrases and words and, lots of things that are specifically Quaker. And so I keep bumping into them. I'm like, oh, I didn't understand what that word meant. Prevented from attending a meeting. How interesting. I didn't know that was, that's just a word, isn't it? But it makes you part of the in crowd as opposed to the out crowd doesn't know. And yet there's other stuff I just take for granted that, you should be polite at funerals and keep your contributions brief and to
Yeah,
the point.
because that is part of the culture. And and I suppose one of the things that I'm forever noticing is where those boundaries, people are less able or willing to set those boundaries. And I notice that in Quaker settings, there's a less there's less willingness or bravery, perhaps it is, to stand up and, say, thank you, friend, or whatever it might be, to be the one to set the rules. And
Well,
it's
it may be
usually just other
confidence.
people.
It may be a confidence. Maybe it's a crisis of confidence that the whole institution is undergoing. And
Mm,
therefore, one isn't confident to do it because that might be bullying or powerful or rude or, offensive, or maybe, you know, one of the isms that needs to go. So that may be what's it.
yeah,
And I think getting to my age, I've started becoming interested in ageism because it exists. And, I don't think you should defer to authority. Well, should you defer to authority? Should you always obey what you're told to do by superiors and in hierarchies? And the answer is, I now think, I mean, I was a radical who would break things down. I now think, well, you shouldn't do it automatically. Respect is earned, not automatic. But people with life experience have got life experience, which people without life experience haven't got. They've also come from another place, and they've left this society in the way it is. So, who are they to lecture us? So I think some of the boundaries between the old and the young, or the long-standing and the new, or people with roles and visitors and new people. They're in this world, everything is a bit shaky. So some of it, I think, is confidence, but some of it is that the old rules are out and the new rules aren't agreed. Or there's the other thing that comes, which we used to talk in feminist circles about, the tyranny of structurelessness, that everyone was equal, but actually there were invisible
yes.
things being pulled. There were invisible, passive aggressive manipulations and so forth. So I think the important thing is to have the space and time and luxury to unpack it and unpick it
Mm,
and
Mm.
Say, well, we agree to disagree.
Exactly. And you've talked a lot about the Death Cafe. So let's hear a bit more about that because I've heard about that, but not in any detail. So what's your role in this then? How have you got involved in it and what do you do?
Well, I've got to an age where, death is, well, we never know when death is coming, but as you get older and you attend more funerals and you collect medical labels, which is, you don't usually get rid of them. Death becomes more a feature. And once your parents are gone, you're next on the escalator. So I think people think about death differently as they are more aware they're approaching it, as opposed to unaware that they might be approaching it. Um, and so when I was walking the dog with various friends, we'd find ourselves talking about it. We read about the death cafe. Oh, yeah, why don't we go to a death cafe, find out what this is? Anyhow, we just got fed up. They were all on the edges of London. So it came to me, oh, we better set one up. And we passed a community centre, which happens to be a rather unusual one near Vauxhall. And somebody came out because it's just been refurbished. They were looking for people to use the space. And we had a conversation in the street, said, come in, started talking about it, looked up the rules in the International Death Cafe website, which is amazing. And it's very much set up on this very open-minded, anti-commercial, no commerciality, no professionalism, put a group of people, strangers, into a room, facilitate them gently, and have conversations about something that's uncomfortable, sometimes taboo, sometimes bothering people. And everyone comes with their issues, and we just have fascinating conversations between strangers. Of course, we have some regulars, we have some people who drop by, we have a little WhatsApp group where we just share
Mm.
books and films and TV program, whatever. um, but death becomes very much more present because of this. For me, it's become very present. Every fortnight I stop and think, I meet these extraordinary people, and in the centre of London we have people from all around the world pop in, and they're students. For example, we had some Chinese, twice we've had Chinese students turn up absolutely distraught because they haven't been told about loved ones who died while they're at college, because they are the privileged person who's abroad, and it would be upsetting. So they don't tell them. So they've missed everything. And you think, goodness. And then somebody else
Yeah.
went to her mother's funeral, and she was with her when she died. She saw the body go into the crematorium. The body came out. They pick the bones out of the ashes with chopsticks and put them into an urn, and the urn goes somewhere, and then they have certain rituals, and then it's de-interred, because the excellent spot with the lovely view has to be used for the next occupant. And so eyes are on sticks. People come talk about suicides in their family. People talk about their own experiences of whatever. People come with trivial things. We have a laugh quite often.
Mhm.
But I think what it does is in some of these gentle, egalitarian, carving a little space for deep listening, in those places, the issue of death just comes up on a regular basis. And we hear from different people with different religions and different religious backgrounds. We talk about assisted dying or not, and well, it's just a lovely service that I did it for myself. I'd like to only facilitate one every four, because then I can chat in the other three, hear the sound of my own voice. Um, but it but as my friend was saying, we are actually providing a service for a community. It's up there on the website. People come
Yeah.
in, and actually several people have come and then set one up somewhere else. So it's sort of catching.
Yeah. So I mean it sounds very much like a Quaker type space, doesn't it? Just a spiritual space. And certainly it sounds similar to what I'm doing in the prison. Quiet group is a space where you've got these rules of slowing down, settling down, waiting for deeper issues to arise, and then listen to others carefully without rushing in. It sounds very similar, and it's so interesting, isn't it? You were saying that, your Quaker history, you're not plugged into Quaker meetings, and yet here you are running a very Quakerly type meeting.
Well, it may be. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I haven't been to any others to find out if they do them similarly. I hear in other places they have lots of tables. 40 people turn up to some. We only have 8 to 12, but and they all sit at tables and they have little, bit of paper, some topics, and they get going. So I presume there's other ways to do a death cafe.
Mm.
And I've been interviewed for some Canadian research about death cafes. So I gather they're not all done in the same way. But
Yes.
if you provide a room and a cake and a cup of tea or biscuit, we only do biscuits. If you provide a setting and you come with a purpose, and there are some vague rules, which is there's not quite a script. We've actually got a little script now just for the start. But I think magic can happen if you put
Mm.
or maybe it's not magic, but special things can happen when you get the settings right.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's hear a bit about your work then, because you've said a few times that's not your expertise in terms of addiction, etc. But your expertise is you're an, if I can say this, obstetrician and gynecologist, now retired.
Yes, yes.
So how has I'm wondering what was your specialism or still is your specialism, and how have your those these kind of Quaker values and this listening or egalitarianism or whatever it is that we've talked about, how did it impact on your work?
Well, I'm not 100% sure about this, but so I'm a fourth generation doctor. I'm not actually sure I wanted to be a doctor, but I didn't have the courage to step out of it. Or, and I was always told, oh, you must do whatever makes you happy. And
Mm, mm.
and I said, well, maybe if I do medicine. And everyone was so thrilled. So I thought, oh, maybe I was sort of subtly pressured. Anyhow, it's given me a very good living. I'm not complaining. And it certainly gives you access, inside people's bodies, let alone outside, let alone into their lives, into their homes. So, it's an incredible privilege to be a doctor. So I sort of struggled a bit, and I think quite often people do because there's a role, and it's interesting talking to medical students, and I still love teaching them, and I used to teach law and ethics, is that it's you're finding out your identity as a young person and trying different things on, and then you've got to put this metaphorical and literal white coat on. And that comes with some very strict rules. There's some very strict things that happen. You will have to defend yourself because you must do this and that, and you mustn't do the other. So, and you've got to be, the best doctors are chameleons. They actually are blank. They shouldn't have lots and lots of symbols in their rooms. I mean, there are people who sit there with pictures of the photos and religious iconography or whatever, and that may just make some patients think, oh, I'm not sure I can tell them this. Whereas, if you're an absolute blank and you respond to the patient and you respond to every patient of every type with respect and non-judgment, you will be more effective as a doctor. And so to be not a nothing, but a tabula rasa you have to be trained into doing it. And I think that's quite hard for young people to both be discovering and trying out who they are, and having very strong views about politics. I'm afraid that you leave that at the door. You're privileged to walk into this space where you have to deal with everyone, however unpleasant and difficult that is. So that's a sort of constant learning about how I step in and out, work and home, and how the work identity is so powerful. It still operates out of hours, and it infuses behaviors and social status as well. Anyhow, that's just a sort of thought about that. So it was always a bit. I think it always was a bit difficult, and although I always felt a little on the edges because in some ways I didn't want to be there. I wasn't completely enthusiastic, but as I went through the various jobs and tried things, I really loved obstetrics and gynecology. This was so I was a student in the 70s. Lots of exciting things were happening, and lots of things were happening about women's role in society, and that women could have it all or should have it all, or that there were still very unmet needs in justice terms. Rape in marriage was still legal then. The Abortion Act of 67 was being argued about over and over. So, there was plenty to do politically for women, legally for women. And in health, I think there was a role because, as we still see, the canon is built on the male body, not the female body as default. And, women's health was was and still is neglected and treated differently. So I sort of was very enthusiastic about doing obs and gynae, and they at that stage 9 out of 10 of the consultants were men, and I remember being furious about some of the things that happened when I was a student. We were in those days lined up with unconscious women to examine them under anaesthetic without consent. So I did a project arguing about that, and we all had to wear mini skirts rather than scrubs. So, some medical students would go into the male changing rooms, get some scrubs. This was a radical act. What else? And I remember one of my first house jobs, a very elderly consultant who would examine a woman with 9 people in the curtained area. And, I would step out because I couldn't bear it. And I couldn't. So there was a lot of things that I saw that I thought like, well, even if I'm no good as a doctor, I won't be like them. So
Yeah.
there's this sort of anti-role model, and I was, very so that was part of the motivation was for the patients, part of the motivation was the interest, and so I did obstetrics and gynecology, and eventually ended up. I wonder why, but anyhow, I ended up doing a new subspecialty because it was all women's health, and then it sort of split into cancer and infertility and obstetrics and so forth, like surgery subspecializes and medicine subspecialized, which may or may not be a good idea because the justification for our specialty is the 24-hour, 365-day a year saving of women's lives in childbirth. And that takes a toll because you need to be there at 3 in the morning. And of course, the interesting stuff is the 9 to 5, where you do private practice. So there's a lot of tensions within our specialty.
Right.
Anyhow, am I rambling on? I'm
No,
getting
no, no,
distracted.
no.
Ah,
I'm so interested in this because I think,
okay.
in terms of Quaker ethics, if you want to put it like that, there's all sorts of things there. I'm thinking about justice and about where is their true vulnerabilities and how
Yes.
do the professions, um, you know, take a stance on each of these things
Well,
can
quite,
actually become part of the abuse if we're not careful, ever so
quite.
careful. And
Well,
I was
very,
thinking about
very
that.
good. So in at the end of the 1980s, I was exhausted, and I remember I was examining a patient with a medical student, and she said, "Oh, I can't find the head." And so I said, "Oh, be careful what you say, because the mum will think the baby hasn't got a head rather than which end is it." Anyhow, the medical student burst into tears, and the patient laughed. And then I thought, "Oh my God, I've turned into the horrible doctor I never wanted to be. I'm humiliating the student." So anyhow, I was exhausted. Took a year off, did a degree in law and ethics, and that just brought me back, some stillness. But it also taught me communication skills. We were never taught communication skills in the 80s at all, 70s and 80s. We learned them at the bedside by osmosis. So we learned good and bad habits. And but doing the law and ethics degree, because I wanted to be a good, legally sound and good doctor. So I thought this was quite a good thing to do. And as it turned out, the profession was exploding with legal and ethical problems. So I was able to not be a legal or ethical expert, but be like a translator at the edge between the medical profession and these other professions of philosophy and law. So I was sort of at the edge there. Um, and I did a particular dissertation on pregnancy, which was interesting. But the point I was going to make about that was I had the year off and came back and then did this maternal fetal medicine, which is high risk obstetrics. And yeah, so then my research when I became a consultant concentrated on, from a conversation with a couple of people, turned out that there was a great interest and absolutely nothing had been done in the UK about violence against pregnant women. So coming back to bringing the justice, bringing the ethics, and bringing the research skills into medicine. And what I really learned from working with Jill Mezzi, who's a fantastic forensic psychiatrist, and Lorraine Backus, who was our PhD student, or it became PhD student, was that there was a lot of it about. If you actually ask, you find that a lot of people have had previous experiences of domestic and sexual violence and other violence, and continuing even during pregnancy. And then the question is, what do you do about it? And what I learned from setting up services that then got copied around the country, because everyone said, oh, you must screen these bad things, you must screen. Actually, that's a huge amount of effort and doesn't necessarily work. Most screening is very harmful.
So hold on a
Um,
sec, because I don't actually understand what you mean now by screening. So
oh,
I'm still reeling in a little bit of shock just from
okay,
the phrase violence against women in pregnancy. Because
okay. Let's slow down and go back to that.
just because I mean I'm almost emotional at the thought of
It's
it.
awful. No, it's one of the biggest taboos. Okay, slow down.
So you see what I mean? This is your research expertise.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
thinking,
yeah, yeah. So I'm getting through.
gosh,
So my one of my first little studies was actually about women who go to the intensive care unit. So although we've cut 99% of women who die in childbirth and in pregnancy, which is from the three great diseases of hemorrhage, sepsis, and preeclampsia. If you look at the historical data and you look at the changes in low and middle income countries, the money rightly is spent on women and children first. You get a tremendous bang for bucks, and setting up services for contraception, safe abortion, and maternal health are, vital. Let alone the education of and the survival of small children, and then their education. So we had free antenatal care in the UK long before the NHS, and
right,
we were giving, things for anemia and so on. I'm just going to swig a bit of tea, excuse me.
it's okay.
So so I then was very interested in the near misses, the people who get, so the large number of people who have a brush with death, and who we save, of sometimes harmed and traumatized, and they go to the intensive care. And so my interest in near misses and death were related to this interest in violence against pregnant women, because what you see when you get rid of the big things is the rarer ones. And it was worked out quite early that quite a lot of women are dying from murder and suicide. Small numbers, but that was now a significant chunk of the rump of what's going
So
on.
during
And
pregnancy, you mean? Murder and suicide during pregnancy.
no, mostly after, but it can be during, because of the violence during. So and I remember every so often there's a case of a pregnant woman who's found murdered, and it always makes the newspapers because it is so taboo. It is absolutely taboo. But the fact that it's taboo doesn't mean it's not happening. And so, because of this conversation about women's lives, the hidden taboo, one of the hidden taboos, is what's going on in terms of coercion, control, physical, psychological, financial, dependent violence
So when you say
within.
it's taboo, sorry, if I can just I'm just getting my head around the fact that you think well, that this is a taboo subject. So what you're saying is that even though it happens, people don't like to talk about it or cover up
Correct,
or
correct.
ignore it or pretend it's not happening
Yeah.
because murder and suicide of women in
Well, I
pregnancy.
think once you've got the evidence for body, you can't ignore it.
Yeah.
Rape, child sex abuse, alcoholism. There's a lot of things that are going on in lives and in relationships and inside the home
Mm.
that are unspeakable,
Mm.
and or if you speak about them, you will get cast out. And
Yeah.
you know your place. You learn your place in, and a lot of cultures reinforce the subjection of women, and the and uh, having any kind of control, whether that's financial control or control over your reproduction through contraception, abortion, and child rearing. These are I mean, birth and death are the most important thing, I think, but and how we live our lives in between. But yes, I think that violence is very common and coercion and abuse are very common, but there is a taboo. There's an incest taboo. We don't talk about it. It happens a bit. There's a and I think it's you are a worse person if you murder a pregnant woman than any other woman. So so I think that so I think exploring that, it was the 1990s before anyone measured in pregnant women what the past and present violence in their lives was. That was our study. And so because it wasn't talked about, and this is part of feminism is being raising these issues. And so the question then becomes, because there are threats to mental and physical health of these situations, these relationships, these behaviors, and we hadn't recognized. I mean, and I remember a patient when I was a registrar, it became clear later. I thought, why is this woman discharging herself from hospital when she could die from, she's got blood pressure and proteinuria, she's got preeclampsia, she could have a fit, she could have a stroke, and she's discharging herself from hospital. Bad woman, bad patient, sign here, you're doing this against medical advice. And of course, it only became clear later that a woman would do that. Why would a woman do that? Well, she might do that because she was more frightened about the two children who are left with a violent husband at home than her own life. And so it was realizations like that through what patients told me and through what I learned, that if you start asking open questions, how are things not bad? What do you mean not bad? Do you mean not good?
Yeah.
Well, there's a few arguments. When you say a few arguments, what do you mean? So once you're ready to listen in the confidential space of a consultation, if you're trusted, people will tell you things. They'll tell you their secrets, and that's a privilege and a burden, and particularly when you can't do anything about it. And so going into the taboo areas of what's really going on in someone's life, it's very important for all doctors. I think probably GPs know this better than anyone else, that somebody doesn't take their tablets because they don't believe in them, or because they're being hidden, or because they're too bound down with all the other things that are going on in their lives. And we've only got a medical fix, which is very limited. I mean, it's very powerful, but it's very limited. So that's how I ended up researching violence in and around pregnancy, and how I ended up setting up services, which I now realize you can't. Screening means asking everyone and fixing something. And it's an inappropriate model. It's a medical model. If we screen you, we can fix your problem that you didn't know about. Whereas education, so that you could create an enabling environment in which people could tell you the truth of what's going on in their lives, and you could support them and possibly point them to community-based services, because their problem lies in the community. It's a civic and civil issue and criminal issue sometimes. It's not a medical issue. It has medical consequences, and that's where the power of the doctor lies, in saying the consequences of these are very bad, and therefore we can raise that with government and public health. We can't fix it with a pill. We often give pills to people who've got problems because that's the only transaction we have, or we give them labels to explain things. But so I think raising the awareness, writing my book, The ABC of Domestic and Sexual Violence. So raising awareness, and then having a specialist knowledge and pathways to help is probably the most we can do, and standing by, which is what midwives with women, obstetricians, obstari to stand with. I think that's been quite a difficult lesson for me as well. How you can't, a doctor isn't a social worker.
Yes.
And a screening test isn't a fix, and asking a question. So I think that's made me think a lot more about the subtleties of these things, by going in with 9-league boots thinking I was going to sort out violence for women during pregnancy, which of course I haven't.
It's such a enormous, endless problem, isn't it? I mean, that phrase, doctors aren't social workers, we get told that. I was told that as a chaplain. Remember, you're not a social worker. And I thought it's quite powerful. You do have to be very limited and accept the limits of what you can do, which is why I go around with the serenity prayer, because it's something I can do in the face of lives which are just infused with violence and manipulation and despair, the wretched state of some people's lives. And all I come around with is the serenity prayer. I mean, it's really interesting in terms of the humility of what it is we can do and what it is we can't do, and dealing with that almost is a it must be a spiritual problem, I think. How does a doctor recognize what they can do for this woman in front of them and what you can't do? Have you thought about it in those terms?
Um, well, not spiritual, no, probably not, because but I do recognize the I do recognize the strange power, the transformative power of moments, that uh, moments of closeness or togetherness or understanding, or the humility you're saying, actually, I can bring nothing, but I have this, is still an enormous gift for the receiver, isn't it? It's a
Yeah.
gift, and the receiver can throw it in the bin, or they can
Yes.
understand that you were trying to connect with them on more than the mere meeting, but on a deeper level and a spiritual level. Um, yeah, I could look back and think there was all that around. Obviously, in the heat of the moment and on the clock and so forth, there would be very little of that. And I certainly worry, and I can see that people's religious beliefs are very sustaining for them to do the work. I also see that bringing religion into a medical consultation, um, having it for yourself or recognizing there's something else is a potential abuse as well. And I've also written and looked at, not enormous detail, abuse of the medical consultation, of the power. So the Royal College of Psychiatrists had a terrible scandal with two psychiatrists who went to jail for raping patients, in the back clinics of, in the evening, offering massage therapy or something. I don't know, but so I got involved in thinking about the concept of the chaperone, the protection
Mm.
in the protection of the individuals in a room privately, and the role of a chaperone, which we've always had in obstetrics and gynecology for the men, not always the women. Um, and then they produced a book on abuse in the doctor-patient relationship, looking at nurses who hit patients, doctors who had sex with patients, psychoanalysts who manipulate patients, and have no regulation, so they can just
Mm.
carry on despite criminal
Yeah.
convictions of sorts. So
Mm.
so the policing of the boundaries of the doctor-patient, of the professional relationship, has become an interest, uh, in my profession. The boundaries of, what is a doctor abusing a patient? Obviously, Shipman killed them, but he also manipulated their will, so it's financial as well. So there's a whole set of abuses that can happen, be enabled, or breaches that you can step back from.
Yeah.
Um, and so and obviously with women's bodies, the breaching comes in very much also with sexual boundaries, and literally a baby comes out and forms a new boundary. So there's some very interesting issues around the boundaries of the body, boundaries of the relationship, boundaries of the language, boundaries of the labels, boundaries of the knowledge schemes we use. Uh, what does research tell us? What's good research? What's bad research? So I think possibly I just like living at the edges of these in my professional and personal life, um, because I think that's it's a place of friction. Everything goes on in an ordered way here. Everything goes on in an ordered way here. This is the interesting place.
Yeah.
So probably Yeah,
And
I
and
was, you know, that,
individuals need to find their own way how to manage that boundary because individuals in these positions come up against these boundaries. And you're thinking about, well, how am I acting here? And how do I feel? How do I cope with my feeling of hopelessness that I know that there's nothing I can do here, or that I can do this tiny little thing and nothing else? And how do you then walk away? How do you protect yourself and come away from that feeling, well, and that's why, for me, it's a spiritual piece of work because in the end, you can only say, right, well, the rest I will leave with God, and I can
yes,
now walk away because I can see people take on board all of this stuff. And in chaplaincy, obviously, it's different, but I can see that some new prison visitors and new chaplains kind of go away with this person still in their mind, really, and the
yeah,
horror of it that's been just exposed in this moment. um and sometimes when you say, you can give people a pill or you can give them a label, and I can give them the serenity prayer, but it's that in that moment you saw them, and in that moment they could see that you had seen them, and that's
mm,
almost all we can do.
correct. Well, I think that's a lot. It is still a lot to do in a short consultation, and um, I mean, I suppose we go home thinking we've saved lives when we haven't. So the thing that's been much the hardest for me is to look back. I mean, while I was doing it, but also looking back on thinking of all the harms we do because of the our actions are always two-sided. So I I find it difficult to think that it would be harmful to give a serenity prayer. I mean, from a chaplain. I mean, it's not as if
Yes.
somebody's suddenly saying something different. It doesn't seem to me that there is any harm. Whereas by their very nature, our labels have a percentage of harm in them. Our poisons from which we're trying to extract benefit have complications and side effects. And our assaults, they would be assaults. What I do to people would be assaults,
Yeah.
were they not consented
Oh, so.
and I wasn't negligent. Um, so, I will do a lot of, I did various operations and would get a lot of benefit. Some people are unchanged and some harmed. So I think living with the harms, we have to believe that we're doing good and we like to be very important members of society, etc., etc. We get paid well, etc. But living with it going wrong is very hard. And so there's this, I've always, when I was talking to students, I would always say there's this kind of dualism. You almost have to hear the most terrible things that happen in women's lives, terrible things. And you may have to break the bad news about their untreatable cancer or infertility or whatever it is. So breaking bad news is hard because you don't want the backlash, and you have to understand the backlash is part. Being angry is okay because you should be angry. So on the one hand, you have to be incredibly sensitive and trustworthy and caring and give the impression of caring even on those days you have a bit drained. And on the other hand, you've got to be able to meet someone who walks into a labour ward, maybe let's say with the cord hanging down through the cervix, and say, "Hi, I'm Dr. Bewley. You've got this problem. I want to cut you open now because we've only got 10 minutes to get that baby out." So you've got to have a kind of, I do not see any people in this. I see a job, and I must just go into job mode. I have to almost be a psychopath with no caring or energy, and we have to learn to toggle in some ways between those states. So I think for me, reflective practice is very good. For others, if you reflect too much, as you say, you can become despairing or hopeless or obsessed. And the psychopaths do very well, because they don't take it home with them, and the bleeding hearts can get very depressed, and and the art of being a doctor is I don't know what the art is of being a good doctor. I'm not sure I was, but I can see that if you don't the psychopaths sometimes they throw the people out and say, "I can't help you, go," and they people hate them, but actually they might be the right thing to say, "Get out of my surgery, your problem lies elsewhere." But I mean, you can do it in a different way. So
Yeah,
I think that it's a tension, isn't it? And
it
you've
is.
got to be flexible because this patient immediately walks in with this problem, that one with a completely different one. And you may have had a much worse problem. Someone's whinging and moaning about something minor, and you've got to get home because somebody, you've got to attend a funeral or a deathbed or something. So, because we're human, but we're not there to be human. We bring our humanity, but nobody wants to know on the postcode lottery that I've got Dr. X or Dr. Y is having a bad day. We collectively have to look after all our doctors that don't have bad days, but that's not the job. The job is not to bring yourself too much in. I mean, of course we bring ourselves to the consultation, but you can't be too individual. That's what I've always thought. And well, I argue with other doctors. Not everyone agrees with me, so that's fine.
Well, I think it's fascinating because I think, when you said something like the bleeding heart, it gets depressed and despairing and can't function anymore, And I think this is why I'm thought of as being too hard, I think, sometimes, and in terms of not being soft enough, if you like, with other Quakers and just saying how it is. And I think, yes, but I'm not despairing because I suppose there's something for me about our own shadow and also our own power, recognizing that we have power over other individuals, for good and for bad, and we have to try to cope with that and manage that, and wherever possible, have all these mechanisms for trying to stay doing good and to recognize, oh, I nearly did bad there, or I did do bad there. And how do you pull yourself out of that? And, maybe put it right, or maybe get into some element of forgiveness or letting it go. It's really interesting. And if you never go into those difficult situations and you never try to have these powerful and meaningful points of contact with people, well, you never have to deal with that. You
Yeah,
just
well,
keep a really
I
easy
remember
life.
they used to say about the politician Barbara Cartland. She was the sort of woman who ran towards the sound of gunfire.
Right.
And I have a feeling that you might be that sort of a person,
Yeah.
and I might be that sort of person. But
Yeah.
but actually, Quakers, well, they wouldn't necessarily run towards the sound of gunfire because of excitement. But I do think that the the friction, it can spark creativity. It can and it can harm. But the means of um, deep listening and not necessarily conflict resolution, but a lot of the mechanisms that are deeped in the peacemaking testimonies are there as well. And yeah, I don't think I should be too rude. Now I retract the bleeding hearts because that was an unkind. It was an unkind characterization. But I was, and it
Well,
was, it was wrong. It was wrong. It
you
was wrong.
contrasted that with psychopath, so I
It's
think I
true,
think
and
both
they
of
were
you.
they, but in a way, both of those were superficial, weren't they? But the toggling between um, heavy duty boundaries with lack of feeling and feeling with lack of boundaries,
Mm.
I think is a constant. I mean, one should move from one to the other, and one should try and steer a path. And when you've got people around you who are more process driven or more feeling driven or more objective or more subjective, when we're all complex tapestries, I think that's the work of saintly people like yourself and the Quakers and the Quaker processes. And I'm very admiring because these are difficult places.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, you see, and this is why, for me, Quaker culture at the moment has become very feelings driven, to use
That's
the
it.
word you've just. And the reason why I'm doing all these conversations is because I'm trying to work out what is it. There's a tension at the moment for me within Quaker culture at the moment, and I'm trying to get at it what it is. And I think this is getting to the nub of it, really. That I'm working in quite. I go into prisons and I go into men's, on the wings and see them in their cells, and I'm seeing them in this despair of detoxing and suicide ideation and all these, and they're in a prison and here they are, and this is where they find a spiritual connection of some, even or just a human connection with me for one moment. And it's like, it's an amazing experience to be there. And then I go to a Quaker meeting and it's all superficial and it's all nice and it's all feelings and, oh, you've hurt my feelings. I was like, I've hurt your feelings? Like, so what? You know? So there's that kind of what you were just talking about, that doctors, you have a patient kind of worrying about this tiny little thing, and you've just seen yesterday something much worse. And that, I think, really captures quite well why I'm feeling a little bit frustrated by the superficiality sometimes of these hurt feelings in a Quaker context or in wider society, I suppose. Nice,
Mm,
progressive, middle class, comfortable culture. It's
mm,
it's yeah, it's interesting to me that it's this doctor-patient conversation has been very illuminating. Isn't that interesting?
mm, mm. Well, yes, and I think, uh, you know, if you don't accept someone's lived experiences, they will feel you don't accept them. That's understandable. And
Mm.
I think and who am I to speak about many aspects of society? I mean, people have spoken to me, and I read about it, but that's not the same as I am that person who walks down the street and has this life, or these things happen to me, or this happens to me because of various injustices that you will understand as a person with a similar injustice, or you won't understand because it's not your injustice. So I do see that. Um, uh, and it's interesting. Well, I was just thinking because my father was my saintly father. The In America, he met the first black professor of psychiatry at Harvard, who's a lifelong friend called Chet Pierce, who in fact invented the word microaggression, which we hear a lot more about now, which I think is a, a real documentable and experienced thing, um, and in conversations, the very words we use, the very tone we use, the
Yeah.
very eye rolls we
Yes.
might use. Um, this is the stuff of the nuclear wars sometimes. Between two friends or a husband and wife, the tiniest little things can set something off. You start it. You start.
Yeah.
So these are definite acts acts of speech or acts of behavior. Sometimes they're literally accidental, sometimes they're learned, sometimes they come from, various entitlements. So I think that they should be taken seriously. Um, but interrogated, and somebody says, "This is my lived experience." I go, "Yep," and the next person says, "This is my lived experience." I go, "Yep." But I can also say that, well, you were cured by homeopathy, or you got better. You had a problem, you took homeopathy, you got better. I, the rational scientist who's seen this tested in randomized trials, blah 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 blah, think that's a placebo. I'm not going to give you that. And I have to give bad news to people. I've given all sorts of bad news, and some of the bad news is, well, those aren't facts, and or well, that's what you think, but I think, and
Yeah.
I come from a different schema. And I think some of the things we're talking about are because we're in a context of the world burning down, wars everywhere, but also being more connected through the internet. So we're hyper aware and much more anxious about things when actually violence is going down and less people are starving, or proportionally, and less babies are being born excessively, etc. So it's very difficult to have the great wars, ideological, epistemic, literal, between subjectivity and objectivity, between identity and values and so forth. I think these are really difficult times. These are difficult times.
Yeah.
But we can be calm and say our processes have got us this far and we can draw on them. And you know, I've also got into difficult space of wanting to look after patients, and even the definition of who is my patient, a female person, a woman, a transmasculine person, a trans woman, my specialty is right there at the heart of things that are going on in this country. The Supreme Court has said in law something about a biological woman, and a biological woman is a thing that I and biologists and doctors can have a view about. It's not the beginning, or it's the beginning, but not the end of who a person is. But it's quite difficult for, and that's that's quite difficult. The boundaries around the words and the definitions and where they're coming from, and again toggling between meanings. I can toggle. I can see a person as female and call him the trans man he, because I can toggle from two definitions. But so I'm involved in some of these debates to do with meaning of words and the evidence of a medical label or an identity. And I've ended up in a bit of trouble because of being cancelled. 20 years ago, I was writing about surgery for mental health benefits to do with identities, and that would be female genital mutilation or cutting, male infant circumcision for religious identification. Very important if this is going to be checked for you to end up in the gas chambers or not. Hard to give up something that you think is benign, but actually babies die and bleed. And so here are some identity issues, let alone the wannabe amputees, let alone genital or chest surgeries of one sort or another. So the concept of surgery for a benefit for a disease or benefit for an identity or a benefit for well-being is a debate that has to be had. So I understand your disquiet and the difficulty of doing it, but we must take everyone seriously, and we must take the ideas seriously, even if we say, but this idea doesn't, A is followed by B doesn't mean A causes B. And you think A and I think B. I mean, these are just very basics, I think.
Well, yes, I'm fascinated by. So you're a gynecologist. Um, so I suppose I'm just trying to think through the impact of all of these issues in your workspace. Um, because as you've just said, when facts come up against feelings, so I suppose for me thinking this through now, the kind of thing I might say, well, this is a fact, and then somebody else has a whole load of feelings around that, which I'm somewhat sympathetic about, but I'm not wholly caught up in their feelings, which of then I'm seen as quite, I don't know, overboundaried or something, or unfeeling. And I don't think I am unfeeling. Anyway, that's just me wittering on, really. But can I just ask you then what it means for you as a gynecologist? You said that who is my patient? Is it just a woman, or is it a transmasculine person, or is it a trans woman? So is that the kind of area that you're...
Well, it's so it I haven't thrown them out even though I'm retired. I have a huge bookshelf of
Yeah.
the obstetric and gynecological canon. And I've studied over and over and over the embryology of creating all the different organs, including the reproductive ones, from the first cell. So I've got, and not the best, expertise in um, sexual differentiation and sex and so on. Um, so our specialty, which is obstetrics and gynecology, deals with the diseases of women, which is the everything to do with pregnancy, which can only happen to females, not all females, 10% don't become pregnant, and the gynecological organs. So it's to do with the cancers and the cysts and the bleeding disorders of periods and so on and so forth. So yes, all girls, whether they now think they're trans boys and take action on that, would come in under that heading. So if they because we study the science of hormones and so forth. The gender doctors, the doctors who are saying we're here to help, are not obstetricians and gynecologists, they're endocrinologists, and the surgeons who are here to help in breast reconstruction or mastectomy or the operations for orchidectomy and penectomy for males and creation of a neovagina, or the female ones, which are much more rarely done, usually just the internal organs. These would be done largely by urologists. The hysterectomy might be done by a gynecologist. So some of these are the boundaries of our specialties, but clearly a kidney doctor deals with kidneys, and women's diseases doctors deal with all the parts of whether it's the embryology, the fertility, the contraception, the abortion, the cancer, the pregnancy, all the rest of it. It is only possible for females. So it could be redefined. There are trans activists who say all reproduction things, all urology, and all as the bladder, kidney, the bladder, and the male parts, and all the gynecology could be in one thing, because women are people who think they're women and men are people who think they're men, and there's all the in between. It should only be one specialty. Well, that is not how it's been constructed, and certainly, I think it is obvious and commonsensical that we are a sexually dimorphic species, and there is a class of female and male. And I don't use the term intersex because that suggests there's something in between, but the definition is an egg and sperm, two cells, the female being the larger, going through a process to make two more cells. So reproduction, which is to do with time and reproducing our cells, there's only two types of cells, one that divides, like cloning, and one that specialist cells that mix the DNA and come up with the unique individual. Incredible. Only two types. Incredible. The evolutionary conservatism of that through millions of years. Two methods to create all diversity of life. Amazing. So I just can't give that up as an understanding. And of course I want to be inclusive, and I want particularly trans men, who I think get a raw deal because they get much less of the public recognition, and I think they've got often more complex lives, which we can see in their comorbidities, and they definitely need obstetric and gynecological help, so we must welcome them.
Do they get it then? What is the situation at the moment in terms of the care that trans men get from your profession? Are there particular issues that you're still working on trying to resolve so that they get the care they need?
So I'm out of this now, so I can't tell you what's exactly going on currently. But I think it's the gender doctors are very much involved in the issue of transition. One of the things that I think has bothered a country that's with a National Health Service, and which is, famous for its research and so forth, is that the follow-up is very poor. And I think that's the lesson that's coming out of the Tavistock. Obviously, trans people have always existed. The use of hormones and surgeries is not entirely recent, but it's gone up a lot recently. And in terms of the research quality, that's argued about. Some people say you don't need to know the research. My identity matters more than anything else. And other people say, I'm sorry, we're dispensing poisons. You can get this over the counter, but not that. If it's really not a bother and just do as identity and it's a human right, it should be over the counter. So then it's not a medical decision. So I think there are arguments around that. And as far as trans men go, firstly, girls go into puberty younger than males, about a year or so earlier. Female puberty is, it's very different. And there's many more taboos around menstruation than there are about growing a beard and having a deep voice. They become sexually preyed upon. So a lot of girls are quite rightly terrified of what happens. I've worked in a rape and sexual assault centre for several years as well. And I think that being a young, can you hear the phone or not? It'll go. I think the experiences are different. And I think probably testosterone given intramuscularly to a dose to the level of males, which is the standard, is much more brutal than an oral tablet of estrogen and some of the anti-androgens that males take. So I think that the field was led by male doctors, largely, for males who are trans women who want to and used to see it as an adjustment of the body to pass rather than an inner sense of rightness. And I think the politics have changed. The DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual criteria, have changed, and a lot of politics has come along with it, rightly or wrongly. But I think that, and I'm doing, I've done a couple of studies on uh, audits in general practice with general practitioners, and I'm doing one at the moment on trans pregnancy, looking at all the papers on pregnancy, which are absolutely full of the lived experiences, the fears, the feeling rejected, the strangeness of um, being a body that is now shown to be female, where it might have passed as male because of the enlarging abdomen, or can you pass as if you're just a beast with a big coat, or do you get rejected by your communities who's saying, well, you're not being trans enough, or you're not being male enough, or do you enter a new community of, what used to be the sisterhood of becoming a parent, a mother, a parent here who wants to be a father but is being a mother, the definition of being mother being the person, the body who gives birth. So I think it's a very difficult thing. And I think there are good and bad players, and I think that the research is very much by the activists, very much about the nasty doctors who reject you, and you'll be rejected by society. And it's also true, you will have mental health difficulties because of minority stigma or whatever. But actually, not just going and saying, how can I help? How would you like to be called? Are you someone who cares about pronouns? I don't think you have to be heavy duty with, rigid, there is only one way to handle this, because otherwise you don't actually get to the heart of, well, does a person who has been on or is still taking testosterone, do they have different risks of prematurity? Might the endometrium be thin? Do they have different risks of complicated pregnancies if they only have IVF and twins? Do they have fears of hospital, that they might be better off out of hospital or with a midwife? Do they have mental health problems that we can just deal with? So I think that and there's absolutely no quantitative data at all. So there's a massive literature. It's nearly all entirely on the subjective experiences, and very little on the objective. And when you find IVF clinics being social justice warriors saying marvelous new markets for trans people and surrogacy and so forth, some of us just go, well, really? And we've got to take people as they come. I've looked after surrogates and the commissioning parents, and my job is to help everybody. But it doesn't mean I don't sort of wonder what's going on. And I wonder if we've got anything special to offer. My guess is that trans people having pregnancy will be, because it's so evolved for millions of years, it's highly likely to be exactly the same. But we do know that near brush with death, and that becoming a mother, and all the support that new mothers, parents need, particularly around breast, stroke, chest feeding, whatever it is, I would hate that to be not available for a trans person who's having a child, because it's so valuable, and we're losing it for so many women anyway in society. It's hard enough having a baby, let alone needing the village around you, let alone needing an internet village. Well, that's not as supportive as your actual neighbors. So I do worry. So I worry a lot, but it's largely not in obstetric and gynecology services. The services being offered are to do with transition, and they're not to do with the longitudinal follow-up and the wraparound care of this as one of many identities.
Yes.
And being as how my father was an addiction psychiatrist and says all drugs that affect mood will be addictive, and having written about some of the things that go wrong with high dose hormone therapy that's used at the menopause, I'm also worried when I hear people saying, I can't stop testosterone when I'm pregnant because it's part of my identity, or because I'm getting cravings. And if you can't have a conversation because your doctor is wicked and is only disapproving of your patient because they're an old-fashioned old transphobe, because they speak a different language and truth and have a different view of the world, then I think we may be missing a trick to help people who have needs.
Absolutely. And then this comes back to, how do you hold that space with an individual in a caring way when you have in your mind knowing the exploitation, knowing the difficulty that they're facing, knowing all of these things, and you still got to try to manage to have that
Yeah. Well, you
sense.
can't look someone and say, so I don't go for screening mammography, for example, because it doesn't work. There's no reduction in death and there's an increase in mastectomy. This is not what you're told when you're offered your appointment. And I'm a very evidence-based doctor, so I don't take that offer up. No, wait a minute, where was I going with that? It was to do with exploitation. So, I can't say to my neighbour, oh, when I find someone's got breast cancer, I'm always interested. Did you find a lump or was it in passing? Because the one with the lump has got the cancer, and the other one may not have a cancer. They may have an overdiagnosed funny little thing, and they might have died age 90 with it. So I find it, and you can't say to someone, I don't think you've got cancer. You can't take a label away. It's very cruel. So it's very hard if you think someone has got the wrong uh, information and has followed that information. And you can't say to someone, well, I mean, I can say homeopathy doesn't work. They just think, oh, you're nasty. But it's very difficult to say, oh, maybe I was exploited. Maybe, that there's that recent thing about somebody whose sister, there's an inquest between the mother and the brother about the young woman who died of cancer because the mother was
Yeah,
believing in
yeah,
natural herbal therapies or whatever, and the brother thought she was exploited. And I, death, exploitation in human relationships, let alone structurally through billion-dollar industries, um, it's very difficult because on a human face, you can't just say, "Well, I don't believe you." Well, you can say it, but of course, that'd be a bit harsh.
yeah.
You know?
Do you feel like you know too much sometimes? Like, is the weight of, like, as you speaking to people, all of that, all of what you've just said there about, you might just be chatting to a neighbor and you know all this stuff. Does it sometimes make it difficult for you in that personal interaction in some way?
Well, I maybe, but I mean, no. I mean, I do sometimes. Um, I'm trying to keep my mouth shut more. Keep your mouth shut, because actually being blunt hasn't necessarily helped me in life.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's not that I'm being blunt, but as I say things that go against the zeitgeist, or you speak up, and I've got an award for speaking truth to power from the British Medical Journal, so I'm very proud of that.
Yeah.
But if you're someone who speaks truth to power, you're also someone who's, annoying or rude or blunt, or, and makes mistakes.
Yes.
What can you do? You just work with the cards you've been given, don't you? So, but keep your mouth shut is something I'm trying to do. A, to slim down a bit, and B, to to hold my tongue, because actually it's wasted if it gets an ab reaction. So I'm a work in progress. I don't think I know too much. I'm far too curious. There's far too much to know. I only know a little bit in the particular ponds I've paddled in.
Mm.
Out there at great, oceans are much more difficult. So no, I don't. Do you think you know too much?
Well, I suppose it's this notion of, how do you just be with the person in that moment while also thinking, oh well, if only you could just if only you could just do that in your life about that addiction, or if only you could just, change that relationship, because I can see that that's having a big impact. And if only you could just develop a spiritual practice or a personal habit that would do this, and all of these things. It's like I know how I would live your life to be happier, and here you are, a miserable wretch of a creature.
Well, and I think probably if they feel you think they're a miserable wretch, that serenity prayer will not work as well as if you are, we're here, and this is all I mean,
It's
it's
interesting,
true.
you see. It's interesting
Do
because
you
I
say, I
think,
think you're a miserable wretch?
no, I never say that.
No, of
I
course
never
not.
say
So
that.
you're saying the same thing about, being judicious in
But
what
but
you
I
say.
suppose the point is that people are saying that about themselves. Certainly, what I see in prisons, people are saying how miserable they are and how wretched they are, and that's a suicide. They don't use those words, but that's the emotion that's coming out. So,
Yes.
so in sense of helping people to move out of that is interesting. I
Correct.
suppose my experience actually is that 1 week in the first few weeks when they arrive in prison, they're saying things like that. They wouldn't use those terms. But a month later, they're happy as Larry, and they've adapted to prison life, and they're pretty much they've reassembled themselves in their kind of character, and they've forgotten that they were so miserable, you know, and they kind of, oh no, I don't want chaplaincy now, you know. It's really interesting how people in that despairing moment simply just need to, I don't know, be kind of held, if you like, and kind of just you're just with them, and there's nothing they need almost. There's nothing they want from you.
Well, I
Been
think
a long
probably
time.
I think the human touch and the human recognition is noted and
Mm,
probably appreciated. And I think that's that seed sowing of
mm,
there are other ways of being, there are other, you know, and I suppose it's the hopelessness. But I do think there's a difficulty one's got to be very careful about. I've got to be very careful. I'm not saying you. I've got to be very careful about patronizing, about pitying, and about uh, again being there and thinking, but for the grace of God, any of us could be walking in those shoes.
yeah,
I try and step in the shoes. I try and understand being in the shoes, and there are those shoes, and so I think that's just a part of being the work in progress.
that's right. Yeah, yeah. Which I readily accept. I'm work in progress. Let's finish with something that you said to me when we spoke a month or so ago. You said something about a family member says that you've got a Quaker-shaped hole in your heart. Is that
No,
right?
no, 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 no.
No? Have I remembered
I've
that
got
wrongly?
I've got some evangelical in-laws
Mhm.
who I find very difficult for various reasons. And but I, you know, with time, see that organized religion has lots of meaning and value and provides lots of services in society and so on and so forth. So my respect has been growing, having been literally brought up an atheist, I
Mm.
thought. Um, and so, but one of them turns around, I was, whatever it said, oh, you've got a God-shaped hole in your heart. And I just thought, well, have I got a God-shaped hole in my heart? And why are you saying that? And are you just, you know, poking on a vulnerable moment to insert your bit of ideology? And you know, people do fixate on, you know, this football club or that political affiliation or this religion
Yeah.
when they're searching for it as opposed to having been brought up. And I just thought it was a very odd comment, and partly because it there was a little needle, but I didn't think, and maybe I have got a Quaker shaped hole, um, or maybe I've got a Quaker shaped, you know, bung in the hole. I don't know.
Well, you,
The analogies don't only get us so far, but
yeah.
I experienced it as slightly threatening, interestingly.
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? So I misremembered
No,
that's
no, 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 no. I think
I
I may have said that. I may have been talking. I may
I
have just
just
moved
wondered
the story.
whether, you know, in this work in progress, which we both accept we are, do you do you still see that the Quaker ways and the Quaker culture, if not the Quaker meeting and community, has a role to play?
Oh,
Do you see
absolutely.
that as part of your future at all? Because as people retire, people typically start to, we get a lot of new arrivals at Quaker meeting as they retire. And I'm just wondering if is that something that you've considered?
Yes, yes, yes. And I'm going to different meeting houses, and I've looked at would it clash with Junior Park Run, or am I getting enough? Am I getting enough? Am I contributing enough? The two sides of that coin.
Mm,
Um, does my spirituality, uh, such as that is not as a word I understand. I don't use that word, but I
mm,
definitely have found much more from singing in a community choir than anything else. And singing isn't there, is it? I don't sing well. I couldn't listen to music for many years when I was far too busy. I think it was too emotional. And there's something where music comes in, which is not the head, sort of, or the heart. It arrives somewhere so that when collectively I sing with good singers and I'm lifted by them, and we sing at a little concert in the Oval Tube Station or possibly the
Mm.
Christmas carols, whatever it is, I definitely feel something reverberate. So in terms of what I'm searching for or what I need that I haven't recognized, I think this weaving is still what's going on. So I don't know what the future holds. I mean, if I have a future at all, but that's why I go to Death Cafe.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
Well,
I'm
we
ready.
don't know, do we? No, I'm really pleased to hear about that Death Cafe, and Quad actually. So, well, it's been absolutely wonderful talking to you. It's really surprised me how your experience of being a doctor has touched and resonated in some way with me being a chaplain. I didn't expect that.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Well, they're both roles, and they
Mm,
both have rules, and they both have expectations, and they both go to places that are very dark and privileged. Privileged to go to places that many are not able to go to,
mm,
and so there will be lots. There are lots of parallels. And one of the best things I ever did, interestingly, was I taught on a law and ethics course with a theologian vicar who dips in and out of faith, I think. But um, we would talk about we have these 3 hour reflective sessions, and the students, medical students, went out and came in, and then they talked about what they were bothered about. And, I would come up with a sort of model about, well, is that factual or not? And he would come up with all sorts of different ways of looking at things.
mm,
But again, they were in categories, and they illuminated the problem, and the student had time to think about. They were really impressed by some charming, outrageously bad doctors, and they were really upset about some of the slights that they could see going on. And they all got obsessed about different things because they were very young, and they were very fresh-eyed looking at something that we would then, like a painting, you can look at a painting and think, I like it. But then people look about the history, they talk about the types of paint, they talk about the schools, and it just deepens it. It doesn't change the initial thing, which is what was there, who was wearing what, where were they sitting, what were they saying, you know, um, and off they went again. So I
mm,
think there are lots of parallels, and I benefited greatly from uh, that sort of theological lens over 13 years of doing these regular but practical reflective sessions with rules about how we were doing it, to get transformative moments for the students who were struggling, often doing law and ethics as a
mm.
BSc third year because they really were uncomfortable about being doctors. So I used to say, "Oh, I'll be meeting you in the second term, and some of you are even down if you want to be doctors." And they all went, "Oh, she can read my mind." Read their mind. It's just a lot of them were struggling, so they thought I was a mind reader, but I wasn't, of course. But it would really help unpick. So that was a bunch of students who needed a bit of unpicking about their discomforts.
Yeah, that's right. Well, this is part of the maturing process, isn't it?
Well, I'm hoping to mature one of these days.
Well, exactly. We're getting there, hopefully. Well, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
No, it's lovely talking to you, and I look forward to doing it more on our paths crossing again.
I hope so.